Hey everyone! Today I'm going to show you how to make a Santa themed dress or just a classic holiday dress for a stuffed animal. Now let's get started! Okay, first I feel like I need to take a second to show off my nails that I worked really hard on. I kind of went overboard, and yes, that middle one is already chipped, but let's just ignore that. To really get started, I'm going to grab the patterns I made. I'll have these linked in the description box, and they were made to fit a Build-A-Bear. So I first need to cut this out of my fabric, and I chose red velvet because it just seemed like the perfect fabric for this dress, but you could really use any kind of red fabric. And I'm going to start with the piece for the skirt, which is the biggest piece, and I only cut out half the pattern because it's so long, but to get the full length piece, you'll want to make sure to fold over your fabric first, and then pin it on top and cut it out, and then you'll have a piece twice the length, which is the correct length. And then I needed 2 of my sleeve pieces, so I folded the fabric in half again so I could cut them both out at the same time. And then for the back pieces, I needed 2 of those that were mirror images to each other, so I folded the fabric in half first, and then lastly I had the front piece, which I just needed 1 of. I don't know how I messed up this neckline so bad, but I should be able to fix it later. Okay, so to put this together, I'm going to start with the skirt piece, so I have that really long rectangle. And then to this, I'm going to sew on some white faux fur. And I know it looks like I gave it a bad haircut, which I did, but I actually cut this piece twice as wide because I want it to be able to fold under that bottom edge. But you don't have to do it this way. They already sell like 1-inch strips of faux fur at the fabric store that you can just buy a yard of. So you could always just sew that straight onto the bottom, but if you have a wider piece like mine, you can use the same technique. So I decided to first flip the pieces good side to good side and pin them along that bottom edge. And you'll see why this jagged edge doesn't matter because it's eventually going to get folded under and just be in the back. Now I'm going to sew straight along this bottom edge with a straight stitch. Now I can flip this down and this piece is connected nicely up here. But the next step is to flip this over and fold the faux fur in half, or what I did is just fold it up and look at it from the front and then adjust it from there. Then I just kept doing that, pinning as I went, constantly checking it from the front to make sure it was even. Now sewing this was a little bit tricky because from the front I wanted the stitch to be as close to the faux fur as possible without actually going over the fur and like matting it down. But I felt like I had to sew it bad side up so the fur wouldn't get stuck in the sewing machine, so that's what I did. But as I was sewing, I kept checking the other side to get the stitch as close to that edge as possible. But now that I think about it, I think I could have sewed with this right side up if I put like a piece of paper under the faux fur so it wouldn't get stuck in the sewing machine. And then you could just rip the paper off. But I did not think of that idea at the time, so mine ended up looking kind of like this. It was not the straightest and most even, but I feel like it's not too noticeable, so I just left it. And next, I'm going to gather the skirt, and usually I do this using a sewing machine, just sewing straight across the top. But I've never worked with velvet before, so I was a little nervous to do that. I think it would have been fine, but instead I'm going to do it by hand using a needle and thread. So as I go, I'm folding over this top edge, maybe 1/4 inch. Then I'm doing a running stitch, which is really easy. You just go in and out of the fabric, and you don't even have to pull your needle all the way through every time like I'm doing here. Here's a little bit of a better angle, so hopefully it's easier to see. Now I need to continue doing this till I get to the other side. I forgot to mention, you'll also want to make sure your thread for this is really long. Once I've reached the other side, I'm going to lightly pull on the thread to gather the material along the thread. And this is going to make the skirt shorter and shorter. So I want to keep doing this until it is about 15.5 inches. And that's the measurement around my stuffed animal's waist plus a little seam allowance. But I'm going to have my skirt closed in the back, so if you want it open and a little extra to overlap, make sure to extend that measurement maybe 1 or 2 more inches. So once mine is the right length, I'm going to lock my stitch by inserting my needle through the fabric, then putting my needle through the loop that forms. Now the skirt is pretty much finished, and I can set this aside to work on the top of the dress. Okay, starting with the 2 back pieces, I'm first going to flip them over and hem the neckline. So to make this easier to fold over, I'm cutting around the steeper parts of the curve, and then just folding it over maybe a little less than 1/4 inch. And after doing the same thing to the other piece, I'm going to sew along where I've pinned with a straight stitch, and then I'm going to do the same thing to the front piece, so just hemming the neckline. Now I'm going to flip the back pieces on top of the front piece good side to good side, and the back pieces should overlap in the middle, but probably not this much because I'm going to make some adjustments to the patterns. But now I'm going to pin these together along the shoulders and do a straight stitch across both of those to connect them. Here is what it should look like. Really quick, I'm going to prep the sleeves before sewing them on. All I have to do for this is fold over that bottom edge and pin it in place and just do a straight stitch to hem this. Now that that's done and I have nice clean edges, I can sew these onto the main piece. If you've watched my videos before, then you know the drill. Flip the pieces good side to good side and line up the curves. It's going to be awkward, but I feel like I did a good job with this pattern of making the curves line up a little bit more than usual, but you might have a little bit extra for the sleeves. I also like to start in the middle so it ends up more even. Now I'm going to use a straight stitch to sew along where I've pinned. I also want to point out that I used probably about 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance when sewing this, and that was not enough because there were some holes that came up eventually. So don't be afraid to leave 1/4 of an inch seam allowance because there is a lot of fabric to work with. Next, I'm going to fold this in half, good side to good side, and start lining up the bottoms of the sleeves and sides of the shirt. Now I'm going to pin along those areas, and at this point, if you have a lot of extra fabric at the sleeves, it'd probably be good to cut those off so you can clearly see where to sew so there aren't any holes or anything. Now I'm going to sew this together starting at like the wrist and then going down to the bottom of the shirt. Now I can turn this piece inside out, and I still have not hemmed the back inner edges, so I figured I'd do that now, so I'm folding over those edges and pinning them in place, as I've been doing throughout this video. And usually I would use Velcro to close up the back, like I do in most of the clothes I make, but this time I ended up using like a little clip just at the top. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but I'll show it later. But it really doesn't matter how you end up closing the back. I just always prefer to have an open back because stuffed animals can have some big heads sometimes. Okay, now that that's done, I just wanted to quickly point out that the edges of my velvet were fraying a lot, so I decided to do a zigzag stitch along those raw edges, which does help a little bit to contain the fraying. Okay, now going back to the skirt, I'm next going to sew on the belt. For the belt, I'm using this piece of black ribbon that I had to cut down because it was really wide, but you can also use fabric for this. And before adding this, I'm spacing out the ruffles of my skirt a little more because by adding the belt, it should seal the ruffles in place. So now I'm flipping the belt and the top edge good side to good side and then pinning it down. And luckily this piece of ribbon was just long enough to reach to the end of the skirt, and now I can sew this together with a straight stitch. Next, I can connect the shirt piece. So first I folded the ribbon up, so now its good side is facing up, and then I'm opening up the shirt piece and laying the front good side to good side with that belt. And I started at the middle to try to center it, but there will be a lot hanging off of one of the sides, or even both, because the shirt piece is longer because it's going to overlap in the back. So once I've pinned that all together, I'm going to sew a straight stitch across there. Here is what it looks like right side turned out, and on its own it looks like a pretty well proportioned dress, but that's when comparing it to human proportions. But for stuffed animals, their torsos are a lot shorter, so this top half is just way too long for me. Seeing how it looked on, I could really only describe it as unflattering, which is funny talking about a stuffed animal because I don't know what we're supposed to be flattering. But what I want to do is shorten this top half and make the belt a little thinner. So to do that, I took this apart and I have to re-sew this, but with a lot of seam allowance for the shirt piece. So as you can see, the shirt piece is kind of pulled way higher than the belt. You can kind of see the belt in the background. And that should help shorten the top a lot. Hopefully you won't have to do this though because I'll adjust the patterns so this top piece is shorter. Here is what it looks like now. I need to trim off this extra red fabric, but then I'm going to add an extra line to this because if you look on the black side, the line is kind of wavy, so I'm going to flip it to that side and straighten it out. Okay, this is almost done, but the back is still open, so next I'm going to sew up the skirt part. So I'm going to fold this in half good side to good side and pin together the sides of the skirt, including the belt since that still has a raw edge. And then I'm just going to sew straight down there. Now this is looking good, but one thing I had to do differently was once I got to the bottom of the fur part, it was too thick to fit in my sewing machine, so I just sew up that part by hand. And I probably should have used white thread for that. Now I'm going to try this on my stuffed animal real quick, just to see where I need the clip to be in the back. And for this stuffed animal, I thought the torso was still a little long, so I pulled the belt up a little bit, and I thought that looked better. And now in the back, I can look at where I need to put my clasp. I'm just going to call it a clasp because I'm not exactly sure what it's called. But it's basically two pieces like this that match up, and there are some holes around the side, which is how I'm going to sew these on. So one's going to have to go on the inside of the fabric, and this is the piece that's going to overlap the other one. And then I can do the same thing for the other side. Then after locking my stitch, I can close this up and this dress is pretty much finished. One more thing I wanted to add on, but in a more temporary way, is a little buckle to make it more of a Santa dress. So I'm just cutting out a rectangle out of yellow felt and then cutting a smaller rectangle out inside of that. And at this point you could just sew this on to the middle of the belt if you want this to be permanent, but I wanted to be able to take this on and off, so luckily felt kind of sticks to other fabrics. Not securely at all, but it'll kind of just rest there. So I'll put this on if I want more of a cartoony Santa look. But another style I wanted to go for is that classic Christmas dress that I feel like I definitely wore when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. And so to do that, I wanted to give this a silver belt, so I had this silver ribbon, and now I'm just tucking in the belt so it's a little bit thinner. And then I plan to tie this in a bow at the front, but I cut my ribbon a little bit too short, so it didn't look the best. So instead, I tied the bow in the back, so from the front, it's just a nice clean silver belt. I really like this style too, it's very Christmas party. But yeah, that is it for the Santa dress. I really hope you try it out. Please give this video a like, comment any video suggestions you have, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Bye!